Disclaimer. I am a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Okay. So, time for another very, very spicy chat. This is going to be a fun one, fam. And one which I might actually lose some subscribers over, but I gotta be the one to say it. All right? Listen, sometimes I'm going to say things that y'all might agree with. Sometimes I don't. This might be something that you disagree with, but all I'm going to ask is that you just hear me out to the end, because I'm trying to be a good person here. All right? That's what I'm doing. I am trying my best to be a good person. Now, we have a guest who we're going to be talking to in a second, but I want to introduce the subject. Okay? Just hang with me. This will be a bumpy ride, similar to like the trans sports ones that we did the other day. I'm just asking you to trust me. Okay? So please do that. We're going to be talking about Destiny. All right? I'm not going to be talking about Destiny in such a way where it's like I want to necessarily have another conversation with him. This isn't, I mean, like, this is partly to him, and if he ever happens to watch this, then, you know, all the better, all the good. But this is mainly to share with you all my thoughts and to tell you all about what I am going to be doing about this going forward. All right? Or how I'm going, or basically like what I've learned from all this and how I want to treat myself, the expectations I'm going to hold to myself, and the expectations I'm going to hold to my community. Okay? So basically what I'm going to do is, before we bring in the other fan, I'm going to give you an overview of my thoughts on the matter, and then I'm going to discuss it with actually the person who was a part of Destiny and I's debate, BookSmarts, right? For people to remember him, he was like Destiny's anger management coach. Good guy. Okay? Destiny got me canceled after I got him departnered. Feels bad, man. I don't either of those things. Yeah. So, 3 main points, right? And I wrote them down, so I want to make sure that I get to all of them, right? The first is that, like, this doesn't necessarily go to the Kyle Rittenhouse and I thing, like the merits of our debate. I do think, on consideration, that he had a pretty fair argument. I still maintain mine. I still maintain the disagreement that we had, but, you know, like, on consideration, I think that, like, his position is a reasonable one to take, right? I think that there's a reasonable interpretation. Like, basically, if you boil down the argument, especially on, like, the law, like, whether or not, you know, violating the law gave him moral culpability, right? It ultimately comes down to the issue of, like, like, on one position, whether or not you're able, like, because you may think that you're able to mitigate the factors which go into a law's promulgation, like, if the law was trying to mitigate children from being able to operate a firearm by virtue of some aspect that is inherent in children, that he felt that he was able to mitigate those factors. If you feel like that is able to escape you from moral culpability, I think that's a fine argument. That seems to be the one that he made. I still maintain that even if he thinks that he was able to mitigate those factors, that, like, even if he did, and even if he's, like, handled guns all of his life, that's still, by virtue of, like, disregarding the law, means that he assumed the risk of he assumed the risk that the law was trying to avoid, and therefore, if he ended up causing the outcome that the law was trying to avoid, then he assumed moral culpability for it, right? I think that his position is a reasonable one, but I still maintain our disagreement. The reason I want to talk about this is because, and I'm not going to play the video because it's already gone around a lot. If people haven't seen the debate that he had with Xander Hall, it was a lot, right? It was like pouring gasoline on the fire, right? It probably didn't need to happen in the first place, but I don't know, it was rough, right? That's not saying anything negative about Xander Hall or Destiny, but, like, it was rough to watch, right? I think that Destiny was right about a lot of the things that he said, or at least I can see where he's coming from, you know? That's a loaded statement, and I'm going to explain it. I think that if you divorce him from the situation, like, even if you think that Destiny was being a bad faith actor in the situation, there is truth to the idea that you should not judge someone or automatically make judgments about people, especially those who you think, A, is acting in good faith, and B, who you think, based on the totality of the circumstances, is a good person, based off of a 15-second clip. Now, people might make the judgment that if you put the clip even into context, that doesn't make it any better, because by virtue of the fact that, don't fucking do this, because by virtue of the fact that, like, it was mainly a problem with, like, a devaluing of human life, that he was wrong, not necessarily that, like, the merits of his argument were bad. I think that's a reasonable position to have, but, like, taking that argument that he expressed with Zan, that, like, people who may otherwise maintain themselves to be good people, that judge others based on a 15-second clip without looking into it, because I think that there is truth to the idea that most people who retweeted or liked the initial tweets about that clip didn't go out and actually, like, see what the full context is. I know that I retweeted it without looking into the context, and I felt terrible about that after I started talking to him before our debate, because he actually treated me kindly, and I deleted it. All right? Because I felt like a shitty person for judging him by virtue of that. And Destiny, I am sorry for doing that. I deleted it. My apology. I hope that you can tell my apology is sincere. I think that as we go forward, right? Now, mind you, that isn't excusing. Now, mind you, I don't think that excuses him from, like, using irresponsible rhetoric, right? I think that he would agree, or I don't know whether he would agree with this, right? But I do think that, like, even if you even if you take that accounting into consideration, I do think that there's a lot of irresponsible rhetoric in there, right? I think that there is here an example where, by virtue of him using, like, a statement which showed, like, basically a dehumanization or a detestment for, in this case, rioters, right? Even if you otherwise think that your argument is valid and justifiable, that is like, he could have put it in a number of other ways that would not have been nearly as problematic, right? Like, he literally could have just said it to such an extent of, like, yeah, I mean, like, there are instances where using force can be justified, and if you have people who are destroying property which is necessary to be able to live life in a capitalist society, then that may be an example where even the worst kinds of people may be able to use deadly force against them. Like, that is a way that he could have said it, which almost guaranteed would not have incited the same kind of responses his did, right? Because, I mean, like, the other day he went on to a stream with, like, Coach Red Pill, where basically, and, like, all of the streams he's been on recently, people have, like, all these alt-right figures have been trying to buddy up to him for his stance, quote unquote, on Kyle Rittenhouse, right? I think that's pretty easy to see that that's a result of his rhetoric, even if his arguments are otherwise counterintuitive, like, don't necessarily agree with a lot of, like, far-right talking points, right? But, like, the point here, and what I want to say going forward, is that for me and my community, all right, first, to the extent that I fed into any of this culture, like, demonizing Destiny without looking more into it, because I didn't. I apologize. There was a point in my stream afterwards where I, like someone asked me a question about whether or not Destiny uses responsible rhetoric, and I think I made an allusion. Mind you, I didn't say anything affirmative, but I think I made allusion to the fact that I had heard someone say that he had sociopathy. I apologize for that. I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong of me. From here going on forward, I'm going to try and aspire to not judge people who, A, I think is acting in good faith, and B, based on the totality of the circumstances, I think are genuinely a good person. And I'm going to hold my community to that. All right? I'm going to be holding my community to that. If I see that kind of shit in my Discord, I'm going to come down very harshly on it. All right? I'm either going to warn you or I'm going to ban you. I understand that this is kind of an area of gray, but I understand that people are going to have their opinions. But I want to make sure that we're not going around judging people, especially people who we may think is acting based on good faith and who altogether is probably a good person. This is going to be something that a lot of people push back on me. And I understand that you might be watching me right now and you might think, oh, well, Destiny isn't a good faith person. Like, based on the totality of the circumstances, he's not acting in good faith and he's not a good person. And you could well believe that. All right? And I think that's a reasonable thing to believe. And this is not me telling you that you need to think that he's a good person. But me going forward, just based on what I've seen, I think that it's reasonable for him to end up with the beliefs that he did, because it does seem like every time he talks to someone more left-leaning, that there is some variation of, he talks to someone left-leaning, they go off stream, they shit talk him on Twitter, rinse and repeat. Okay? I think that's even if you don't think that what he said is agreeable, even if you detest him, I see why he could end up the way that he did. All right? Destiny, to the extent that we may ever interact together, I hope that it goes over well, but this isn't like a call necessarily for us to act together. I don't know. I'm sorry. Now, with that all being said, I'm going to join the call with BookSmarts. Hello? I can't hear you.
Oh, my bad. I forgot I was on push to talk.
Oh, you're all good. I'm sorry. I basically I wanted to give like my little spiel before I brought you on. How much of that were you listening to, or did you not listen at all?
I caught most of it, I would say.
Okay. So yeah, hit me up. What are your thoughts?
Sure. I'm
And
not
mind you,
sure if
like,
you wanted to start anywhere in particular or if we wanted to talk about those previous comments or.
we can start wherever you feel is justified or wherever you feel most comfortable. I mean, like, I think I basically have laid out my positions on it. I mean, fundamentally, like right now, I'm trying to take what is like I don't want my position to come off as like condescending. I am just trying to be like this is me just trying to be the best person I can, even if I am like steel manning his position. You know, just trying to do what I think is the right thing, even if it's not right.
Oh, okay. Like I detect this kind of uneasiness in your tone about whatever we're doing here. So I guess I should start there. What do you think is like the difficult thing about the conversation we're going to have? Like, and what are you worried about audience members like being upset about?
Well, I know that Destiny has mistreated a lot of my audience members, right? I see Sister Rose commenting, and I know a little bit of the context about that. Like, for example, Destiny will often like retweet like very small people, very small creators who are talking about him. I know that there was like a thread where like Sister Rose was talking with two other people, two other more lefty content creators when all of this was going down. They're all kind of like shitting on Destiny, right? Or talking negatively about him generally. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that's an unjustifiable position, but that Destiny retweeted one of them and basically just like brought down. I think that this would be a correct characterization of their argument, brought down a lot of harassment onto the smaller creator, right? So for me, right, and this isn't like a single one-off instance. This isn't like a single one-off instance. I think that a lot of people do not have a good opinion of him, and I think that Destiny acknowledges this, right? I am trying to, for me, right? I am walking a careful line because I'm trying to express what I do believe is the right thing. That we should not judge people who we think is acting in good faith, and b who we don't, who based on the totality of the circumstances is likely altogether a pretty decent person. But I'm also trying to be very sensitive to people who believe that they have been harmed by Destiny, and I'm not trying to take away validity from their beliefs either, right? So there's an inherent tension between these two different ideas, right? And I'm just, as I am talking about this, trying to balance those tensions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I guess the way that I view it though, because like if I give credence, I think, to the complaints that Destiny gets, I think the farthest that I can take the complaints and stuff is that he's a jerk. Like he's like an asshole. And,
Yeah.
and I get that. I think he can agree with that too.
Hmm.
And I think he said as much. So if people think that of him, I can totally see that for sure, especially if it's based off of a personal interaction you've had, which unfortunately, he's given many people the displeasure of, both
Yeah.
small and big alike.
Hmm.
So if you don't like him for that reason, I think that's fine. I think like if I were to say anything to the other side that really doesn't like this guy, because I find endearing qualities about him, like his ability to argue and stuff like that that I like. I think just try to make sure that you're not overextending on that hate. Like you're not taking that to places where you probably shouldn't. Like you can not like somebody, they can be a jerk to you, all these kinds of things, but you don't want to wish them harm, or you don't want to wish like ill things upon them necessarily. And I think everybody just like try to keep that in mind too. Like you can dislike them, you can constantly vocalize that, but I think just making sure you don't go like above and beyond that to like ruin somebody or something like that maybe is worth considering.
Yeah. No, and actually, that's probably like a fundamental place I'm operating from, which is a hard place for people to come from, right? Like it's a hard mentality to adopt. Maybe part of this relates back to like my experience working in the South when I was a leader of a homeless outreach nonprofit. Because mind you, when I say that in the vacuum, I don't know. Most people think it's like working with homeless people in the South is like an openly queer person. But like it's not like a lot of people who I worked with are what you may otherwise define as like a quote unquote good person, right? But I would often find myself in these sort of circumstances where we were the last place that people could go, right? Like if we could not help someone, there was nowhere else that they could go to be able to find the kind of help that they needed, right? Whether it was food or water or housing or what have you, right? And so that was a place, and mind you, I'd had other experiences with my life, experiences with family, growing up trans or closeted, and I'd had similar experiences where, I had to learn to be able to care about people and do the right thing for people, even if I otherwise don't necessarily personally agree with them or if I personally don't like them, right? That's a very hard mentality to have, but it's one that I think that I would like to challenge myself to do in this kind of a circumstance, and one that I want to challenge my community to adopt.
Yeah. And maybe one thing to kind of help that process, and one note I wanted to bring in here is kind of how can we as like normal lay people understand these conversations from his perspective, because that can be difficult for a lot of people too, like
Mhm.
let alone liking him, or not, like, keeping a check on how far your hatred takes you of somebody, but like actually seeing things from his perspective is going to be like even more difficult. So I think when he goes into these conversations where we're discussing ideas like the ones that you and I did,
Mhm.
um, what he's doing is he's limiting everything to this kind of premise conclusion sort of thing like you talked about. And I think you formatting your argument for that going into it helped you a lot, and I think you guys were able to move much more efficiently because you were willing to be flexible in that way and work with him on that, because that's something not a lot of people do. Most people go into it wanting to have like a normal, what they would call like civilized conversation, where they're kind of able to feel out the topic and move in what they would consider like a normal fashion. But what he's
Mhm.
looking for is uber specific. He really wants those things, and though he told you like, I don't expect those going into this, you kind of need something like that, or to have done or thought about it that way, to really have a conversation with him about it, because that's immediately what the conversation turns into. It's immediately like, hold on, how exactly are we wording everything? What do these words like, what does each word have as far as like logical implications, and like constantly viewing things in terms of arguments, and how is this going to play out? And that really changes the dynamics of the conversation, or where the focus is, or where we're putting like attention, like where we're going to spend time talking about. So to the audience, they may be like, why are we losing a bunch of time on this pedantic point about age or whatever? But
Mhm.
from his perspective, if he gives up on this one little point, kind of his whole argument falls apart in one way or the other. And though we
Right.
don't see that from the outside, it can be like confusing for the audience member, I think.
Yeah. No, and I tend to agree with that, right? It's I mean, like, one thing that's benefited me is that, like, fortunately this is the way that a lot of people think in the legal profession, and so like that's definitely, I think, helped me because I tend to think a lot more in terms of like premise conclusion, especially like in syllogisms, right? Major premise, minor premise conclusion. But like, I just with that perspective, with that background, like it's pretty easy, at least for me, to recognize watching him, that is kind of the way that he, and to an extent like Vosh, tend to think, right? I think that there's probably some merit to the idea that, like, since Vosh was a fan of his for such a long time, that he got like a lot of how he thinks and argues from him, right? There's probably
Mm-hmm.
some truth to that idea, right? But I also understand that, like, for a lot of people who watch, that's not a, like, it can be confusing, and so like I try to be very careful that, like, even if I do like bake that into my arguments that I do on my own, like on my own videos and my own channel, right? I do try to be very conscientious that I'm phrasing it in such a way as to be most accessible to the audience. But like with Destiny, that wasn't a place where it was really, where I couldn't really be afforded to do that, because I knew that he was very like, I like kind of what you said, I wanted to make sure that I was being very responsive to him because I wanted to have, like a nice conversation. That's really what I
Yeah.
wanted going in, because like even in our DMs, and again, I have to credit Destiny here. Like every interaction that we've had personally has been just fine. He's been kind to me. Um, and I can't say anything negative about him in that regard. Now I will say that after our debate conversation, whatever people want to fucking call it, that there were a lot more transphobic comments in my comment section. I don't know if that's a consequence of me just growing or if that's people from his community. I don't know. Destiny, just like, if you're watching this after the fact, like, I don't know, do like a vibe check when you're able to. But like all of our personal interactions have been great. Um,
Mm.
so I mean, like, so I'm trying to think of where I was going with that.
Um,
Or
I
sorry, you can
mean,
go ahead.
like, we could build off of that. I
Mm-hmm.
have notes about like a question that you posed that I think we both missed in the moment that I would like to
Oh
go
yeah,
back and
go for it.
address. Or,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So you asked, I think about three-quarters of the way through the conversation, you kind of brought us down to the point where you're like, could you like think of a reasonable person that could exist that interprets it the way I do, that interprets it like this way.
Mhm.
And I think because we were dealing with similarly worded things before that, we missed the nuance in the change of the question that could there possibly exist a single person who believes this way that you would consider reasonable? And I
Mhm.
think that would have been an easy concession for our side to kind of arrive at some better kind of agreement, and we missed that. So I apologize for that, because if I would have picked it up in the moment, I would have been like, okay, this is an easy concession. Let's just give this. There could be at least one person in the entire world that we would think is reasonable that interpret it Riley's way, because we at least think Riley is intelligent and she's come up with it this way. So I felt like that would be an easy give, and then working our way up from there. But it didn't happen that way. And so I apologize for that. That was one little thing I missed.
You're all fine.
And then to kind of talk about some of the arguments there, I wanted to talk about the spirit of the law thing, where you said that essentially lawmakers, if we didn't have restrictions placed on them from the public, would decide against allowing people to own guns. That in a perfect world, these lawmakers would have decided to not let anybody have guns. Is that an accurate
I'm trying to
rewording
remember.
or?
I'm not sure if I put it necessarily that way, but I think I could adopt that premise. I don't know what it
Sure.
came up, but I think that in like a perfect world where lawmakers would base their lawmaking decisions based on what is most empirically verifiable, then yeah, I would think that lawmakers would come up with laws or like an anti-open carry law that would just prohibit open carrying for anyone, because there's enough academic consensus, I think, that like shows that it doesn't reduce harm in the way that people would want it to.
Okay. And kind of building on that, then you would also think that like legislative bodies in general should take this role of like protecting us from anything that's like reducing public safety. Like how kind of far does that go in your mind?
I'm not sure if I would extend. I mean, like, you have to be like careful. It's like a weighing. There's like a counterbalance in there, right? Um,
Sure.
like there does have to be like, I'm trying to think of the way to do it. I mean, like if we're talking about the cars example, right? Like technically, I think that riding in any car is probably going to increase the likelihood of you suffering. I mean, like it will increase the
Yeah.
likelihood of you suffering a car-related injury by a non-zero amount, right? But I think that like here, there's a special consideration because like it's specifically like we're talking about a safety law, right? We're talking
Yeah.
about a law which is explicitly going to mitigate the use of something which is designed with the purpose of causing harm either to a person or like if you're using it for sport, right? I think that there is afforded like special consideration about like more consideration for lawmakers to limit use of said firearms, or said kind of like dangerous items more than like limiting other forms of activity that could otherwise cause harm to people.
Yeah, I guess my problem with that though, and kind of what we're seeing both in the last conversation and kind of already in this one,
Hmm.
is that without like that's something that lacks like any kind of solid metric or rule system that we could apply to
Hmm.
determine like consistent outcomes, right? Like we would
Hmm.
have to say, well, safety has to stop somewhere for cars, obviously, because people are going to have to drive cars, but
Yeah.
I think like it's obvious enough empirically for guns that we'll ban guns, but figuring out where that line is, I don't know if we could write rules to figure that out. Do you think we could?
No, but I don't think that's necessarily necessary, right? Like we have plenty of laws in society which basically like anytime that, for example, you have a law which incorporates a reasonableness standard, usually it means it's based on something to the effect of the totality of the circumstances, right? Like, for example, that is our standard for use of force under the Constitution, right? Or as interpreted by the Supreme Court, right? Because you have a lot of instances where police will use force where there's going to be a lot of nuance and variation. Now you have courts which interpret that standard, and you have a lot of like specific kind of instances which have arisen that courts have given different interpretations on. Some courts in Wisconsin might say, oh, well, this kind like circumstance with X, Y, and Z factors is definitely an excessive use of force under the Fourth Amendment, whereas in New York court might say the opposite, right? But I think that they're like with certain kinds of areas, like we can't expect the law to be all encompassing. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Sometimes it's a lot clearer and easier for us to be able to say when that's the case and otherwise. I would say that using guns is one of those cases where it's pretty easy to see where the line is, whereas like with cars, it's a lot grayer.
When you say it's easy to see the line, so that was the entirety of my question. So the
Hmm.
entirety of my question is, we can't create rules, right? You would agree that we can't create rules to dictate these outcomes. This is whether we want to pin this on some kind of abstract thing like the collective will of the people, or some broad idea of empiricism. All of these things are going to be kind of amorphous, abstract. They're going to change over time. Different people are going to come up with different conclusions. So all I'm trying to pin down right now is like,
Hmm.
we definitely can't come up with like solid rules. We have to appeal to something that's like abstract, right?
Well, I don't know. What do you mean when you say that we have to appeal to something abstract, like in the making
Yeah.
of a rule, in the codifying? Like, what are you meaning?
So like part the biggest reason that I'm here is as like kind of some kind of advocate that wants some closure on the destiny thing. So what I'm
Okay.
trying to do is take that strictly logical approach where we need premises and we need rules to dictate some kind of outcome. So
Yeah.
if we can't figure out some kind of premises or rules here, then I kind of wanted to move off of it to the next thing.
Okay. Well, I mean, like, I guess that the premise on it, like, I guess I'll try to answer that to the best of my ability, right? At least concerning this, right? I think it's pretty easy to tell that with this law, it was in some way trying to mitigate the harm that someone under the age of 17 could cause, either death or grievous bodily harm to another person.
Could I
What the
pause you?
Yeah, go for it.
So I understand for this law in particular, and chat may be upset at me interrupting, but I just want to say this because the last point that you gave me in response to this kind of echoed this one, where it's like all that I'm looking for in particular is a rule. So I
Yeah.
understand we can go, well, generally I can't say, but for this one in specific, I think we could probably agree that it's reasonable. That's just not somewhere that I want to go, because I think where he was
Hmm.
trying to go is he's created rules that can give us like consistent outcomes regardless of the scenarios that you give him, whereas yours is going to rely on the individual person to just kind of hopefully come up with the right thing. We can't create rules that we would give to that person to come up with that thing.
Well, can you give
Anything
me
that
an
we would
example of a rule? I think I'm a little hung up on like what a rule is that you're defining it.
Yeah. So if we came up with some premises and some conclusions that we could use and we could follow along to give us some kind of decision on the safety thing. Because remember that what I'm asking you here is when you're appealing to this idea of like, well, once the safety threshold crosses some unknown amount, like once the empirical evidence reaches a certain point and lawmakers feel like, oh, that's way too dangerous, they're going to legislate against it. And I'm saying where that point is, and I'm not saying I disagree with you either. I would mostly agree that this is an amorphous point that we can't really put our finger on it. But he thinks that you can. So I'm just trying to like make sure that we can agree that it's amorphous and you probably can't. We can't like draw the line of like where something is too unsafe and legislators should for sure act. We can't create some kind of rule set like that. It would probably be like next to impossible.
Hmm. Well, let me think about this because I think that it's not necessarily getting at
Maybe not
necessarily
where
the
you
thing
want to
that well, I
go.
mean, it's not necessarily well, I'm not sure if it's necessarily getting at my argument for moral culpability.
No, it's not. So I'm asking you like a
Hmm.
very specific thing because I want
Yeah.
to see if we can get an answer on this. And if we can't, I think that's going to be satisfying to the Destiny people to just say, no, she doesn't have a rule for this part. So just stop bugging her about it.
Right, but I mean, like, so you're asking me if I can understand it correctly, like, at what threshold of truth or at what threshold of like evidence does a lawmaker have to have before making a law on the basis of that truth? Is that the question?
So what you described to me was you said the
All
reason
right.
why guns specifically, we can common sense say like, well, these laws, these safety laws around guns, obviously the legislators in a vacuum would legislate against guns in their entirety for open carry because it's unsafe. And I said, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, like where do we draw that line of safety for other things? How are we so certain on this for guns? What is the standard for this? And if there is a standard, then we should be able to apply that to cars or anything else and produce some kind of result. If we don't have a standard there, personally, I think it's fine. But for the sake of like the way that Destiny argues and stuff, if we didn't have some principled way of handling that, we couldn't. And like if I get any give on this, where it's like, no, I don't have some like arbitrary rule for determining this thing, where we would go from there is like I want to talk to you about the 18-year-old thing.
Okay.
So if you're
I
kind
mean,
of wondering where this goes, that's where I would go next.
yeah. Well, I guess that where, because no, I feel like there is a rule that I have in there. It's just kind of like baked into, like it's a baked in assumption, right?
Yes.
So I guess that like if we're looking at Kyle Rittenhouse evaluating, I guess, or if we're looking at a reasonable person evaluating such a law and like making a determination for like what a threshold is for determining a basis for a law. Again, if I'm correctly
For the
understand,
safety.
for the
So
safety.
making the determination that, I don't think all of society should actually have access to this thing at all because it's so unsafe. Like, where is that? Where's that line?
Right. So I guess that for me, it would be at the point where there is like broad academic consensus on that issue, because that's generally where I'm operating from. Even if you live in a
Okay.
culture where there is, and again, like I don't know Wisconsin culture. I know that Destiny made some gesturing that like there is this culture, or there may be a culture in Wisconsin which is more pro gun, or where people use guns more. But I think that even if you come from that sort of a background, if you live in a society where there's pretty easy access, and mind you, like a lot of the sources that I looked up for this are like only a Google search away, right? Like it's not hard to find them. In a society where there's pretty broad academic consensus that open carrying a firearm in any case does not mitigate harm, but instead increases a harm, I think it's a reasonable expectation. Not that someone automatically believes that it's dangerous to have a gun or to open carry a gun at all, but rather that would cross their mind at some point. Like I acknowledge that he might otherwise have come to the conclusion that that the law may have been trying to get another thing, that there was something about his age in particular. But I see it very hard. Like I guess it's very hard for me to see like a world where he never considered that the law was trying to mitigate specifically harm as caused by someone using a firearm, whether it was
Yeah.
someone under the age of 17 or just in general.
And to be completely clear, unlike my position, which is
Hmm.
obviously going to have nuance compared to Destiny's, I would agree with you there. I think we can have a reasonable expectation that if Kyle saw that law, he could reasonably expect that that law is meant for you, buddy. And like, regardless of what kind of reasons we have for the safety, I
Hmm.
think you're the outlawed group. Like something about your age, your brain development, whatever the reason is, we've said that you're not allowed to do this. So just because you think you're above the law, for me personally, that's not a very convincing argument for why
Hmm.
you're all of a sudden allowed to like break the law, or we're not meant to consider it. But then again, for me personally, also to like give more nuance to this at like a bigger level, I think that this entire situation should just be judged on self-defense. And I think if we look at self-defense, it seems to be clear, at least to me, that he acted in self-defense. But
Yeah. Well, I mean,
people are not going to be happy with
well, I
that.
mean, like I mean, like, and people might not, like, and again, like from a moral sense, I think that he at least can sell to a jury that he acted in self defense. Like I said in the debate with Destiny at the right at the onset, that I think that there's at least enough evidence for a reasonable jury to be able to come to a conclusion that he did act in self defense. For me, it's like this is only relevant to the extent that I think it has to do with moral culpability. I think that the legal argument is not necessarily completely open and shut, right? Like it will come down to
Mhm.
like how good the lawyers are at trial and how well they're able to argue their sides. But like I do think that there's a lot more evidence for self defense, at least in the second video. The first or the at least in the second instance, the first instance, I don't think that there's enough evidence for me to say conclusively either way.
Sure. Um, so we can continue with kind of what you gave me, which is more than before. So now I'm understanding that broad academic consensus that has labeled something unsafe is kind of where that line is. Is that correct?
I would say so, yeah, or at least
Okay.
I think that I adopt that position.
So I would like to in good faith say that this is probably step 1 in like a larger process of figuring this out, because once the broad academic consensus is that something is unsafe, I can still think of plenty of things that academics will probably agree are unsafe that I still want people to have the ability to legally use.
Hmm.
And I'm sure like just kind of wording it that way, we can all probably come up with some things that we would want allowed. So
Hmm.
after that, what further specifications can we add to this?
After that, I would say that like if we have something which, uh, for example, there's broad academic consensus that it's not safe, and something which is designed overwhelmingly with the purpose of causing harm, right? So, like for example, if we were going to evaluate whether or not someone can like smoke cigarettes. There's a vast overwhelming consensus that smoking cigarettes is bad for you. But I don't think that there is as much of a leeway necessarily for limitations on people from being able to smoke. There's probably like an argument for people under the age of like 18 and that like it affects brain development and similar things, right? But like there are other things that people could justify using that for, right? For example, like using it for, I don't know, like a lot of people like to smoke it to blow off some steam or to just relax or whatever. I don't, but that's what people tell me, right? And so in that sense, right, like there is another predominant like effect, like there's another primary reason why people buy it. I don't think that people buy cigarettes with the intention of like killing themselves, although I don't know, maybe there are some people out there. I have other worries about them in that case, right?
Yeah,
But
some
like
poetic folks.
yeah, exactly. But like there's a difference between those kind of uses and this, where it's like yes, you can use guns for sports, and mind you, like I'm not advocating that people can't own guns. I come from a family of hunters, right? Like I've hunted myself. Like everyone on my mother's side has probably hunted at some point or another. I have a freezer full of venison in my kitchen, right? Like, I don't think that gun ownership is bad in and of itself, right? But like there's a difference, because like in that instance you have gun ownership which goes more towards sports usage. But like when we're talking about something like the gun that he was using, it was like an AR, it was like some kind of assault rifle, right? I can't remember the specific model, but I remember looking it up with other people. Like it's a gun that's designed pretty much explicitly with the purpose, and especially if he's taking it not to go hunting or to do sports, but like to a protest to quote defend his property. And it might have been a different situation if he was just stayed on his property, right? But like he wasn't using it for a non-lethal purpose, right? And in the same way that, and so I think that like, if we're talking about laws, going back to the original question, right? Like I think that that's sort of like the next step for me. Like it's not only that there is something which broad academic consensus recognizes as being as increasing statistic likelihoods of causing death or grievous bodily harm, but also that we're talking about something which is explicitly designed or created for that purpose, and which is primarily used to cause that outcome.
Sure. Okay. So basically the only thing that I've kind of added on to our definition, so far it's the broad academic consensus is that this thing is to be labeled unsafe, and then from there, if it's designed to cause harm, where I want to kind of explore based on what you gave me there is, you kind of talked about how ownership of guns is not bad, correct?
Ownership of certain guns, I would say, right?
Okay.
Like hunting rifles, I think are completely fine, especially if you're going to use them to go hunting. Like, yeah, go nuts.
Okay. In our moral ideal thing that we're using to kind of explore your rules for things where we don't have like limitations on legislatures and stuff, would you then say that like they shouldn't restrict ownership of guns because ownership is okay?
So I mean, like, and here I want to be careful with my words, because I know that there are mixed kinds of studies on whether or not gun ownership inherently increases the risk of harm. I guess that here it's because I have to think about how I want to word this. Sorry, go on.
No, never mind. If you want to think through it, you can. I just feel bad about doing this like logical 1-2 step gotcha whatever thing. It's not usually my style. So if at any point you want to like you want like my input on anything, just let me know.
Okay, well let me ask you, do you think that gun ownership in general at all increases a likelihood of death or grievous bodily harm?
I think based on the rules you've given me, you're probably forced to like not allow gun ownership, but I don't think that that's something you want to do.
Well, no. And I think that goes back to the rule, to like the second principle, right? Because I would maintain that certain guns, right, especially like hunting rifles, and maybe we want to add on a third rule, right? Because I do think that using guns explicitly, and this is what I said in when I was talking to Destiny, right? I think that there's also an acceptable circumstance, maybe an exception to the rule, where you can use guns for the purposes of like self-defense or defense of property. I'll get a lot of pushback from people who are more left-leaning than I on that premise, and I'll explain it, right?
Can I pause you there?
Yeah, go for it.
So I want to make clear to the audience that based on the rules that Riley has given us so far, that's not allowed in her hypothetical, because she said that the gun ownership thing right now is so far not possible. So we wouldn't be able to protect stuff, which is why I'm kind of focusing on ownership right now.
Well, not necessarily. But yeah, if we're focusing on gun ownership, I think that that goes back to the second premise where you have something, or again,
that is unsafe and designed to cause harm. So therefore, we would not allow people to have it.
yeah, and that's why I would say that I would carve out a specific exception to that rule, right? I think
For
that's what I said.
self-defense.
Yeah. Based off of
Okay.
the idea, like that's what I'm saying, right? Is that like I
So
understand that there are these premises that I've laid out, but I do think that despite those, even if you fulfill both of those first premises 1 and 2, that there are still otherwise permissible exceptions, which we, based on like broad
intent.
policy ideas, may otherwise still want to permit people to have gun ownership. Even if you have instances that fulfill steps 1 and 2, I think that there are very specific circumstances where it's still allowed.
Yeah. Do you want to flesh out a rule for that, or is this where you think we get into the fog of like impossibility of rules? Because I think the next rule would be something in regards to intent.
I'm not sure about intent. Let me say it right now, and we'll get into it.
Sure.
Or if we get into it, then we will. I think that then, like the exception that we carve out. So like you have rule 1, something is shown broadly to cause death or grievous bodily harm, and 2, that thing is designed specifically to cause harm. I think that 3, then there are instances, even if you meet both rule or premises 1 and 2, where people can still use a gun, if it is for specifically either self-defense, or
Well, hold on, because we haven't resolved the ownership thing. So far,
how we have,
ownership is still not allowed.
how is ownership still not allowed?
Because ownership actually breaks your and I have this divided into 3 parts so
Mm-hmm.
far. So I have broad academic consensus.
Yep.
If that consensus labels this thing specifically as unsafe on top of causing harm,
Mm-hmm.
and then the thing itself is specifically designed to cause harm,
Mm-hmm.
then we're not allowing that. And that's kind of where that stops. So I'm trying to figure out what the next step would be, because otherwise we can't allow people to have guns.
Okay, hold on. I think that there might be a misrepresentation then, because I'm not saying that people cannot necessarily own guns. I'm saying that people cannot use
Hmm.
them in that capacity.
Well, we're trying to figure out these rules are for what things we ban. So whether that's guns or other sorts of weapons, I'm just trying to flesh out what the rules are for that.
Well, do you agree that we can ban use of certain things and not ownership of them altogether?
The rules that you've given me don't allow for that.
Well, what part of the rule? I'm sorry, then that may have been a misrepresentation, because I thought I was making it
Yeah,
very clear that I was
because
talking
this
about
entire thing is
use.
about what things we ban on the grounds of safety. And then I'm asking you what kinds of steps or what kinds of rules do we need to figure out what we ban on the grounds of safety.
Well, I was specifically
And so
talking
far,
about. I'm sorry, then maybe I wasn't. All right, so from the
oh
beginning, I
yeah,
was talking about
may,
broad academic consensus that
so
specifically
I,
open carrying firearms increases the likelihood of death or grievous bodily harm. Not
yeah.
necessarily ownership, but open carrying is the evidence that I was appealing to, I suppose, in the first premise.
Okay. Well, I guess open carry, unfortunately, is not distinguished by this third step, which is that the thing is designed to cause harm.
Well, what if
I
you?
think we would need more nuance to catch open, but allow for just general ownership, because you're focusing on the object itself. You're saying if this object is designed to cause harm, so that stops at the object. That has no care for what the intent of the owner is, which is why I'm saying intent seems like it would be the next step for you, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I'm not sure if it is. Again, like these are more like elements for me, right? So if we're doing an elements-based analysis, you need to meet each of them in their entirety, right? It's not so much steps to me, but they're more about you need to have things X, Y, and Z in order to come to the conclusion, right?
Oh, okay. So far we have X, Y, and Z. So I'm trying to, I guess, and this is again where we're going to keep running into a problem, because I want you, in Destiny wants you to make rules that are always going to give us outcomes. But you're saying, well, of course, it's going to be about these elements. Once we put those elements together, then we have to make a choice based on those elements. But you don't have rules for those elements. You kind of have like quasi rules, but ultimately there can be overriding things that go, well, if they're using it in self-defense, then that's probably okay. Then that's probably fine.
Well, I
And I'm
mean, this is
saying,
the
well,
way that
that's tough because we don't have rules to determine what those exceptions would be.
well, they are rules. I mean, like this is the way that larger society functions, right? Like in literally
It
any
is. It's
law,
just not the way the logical thing works. And I'm just trying to railroad you into logic. And
Mhm.
apologies for the audience if this is frustrating. It's not normally how I have these, but I'm just trying to see if I could maybe get more out of you than he got out of you. But it doesn't seem like we will, because we'll reach this area where the individual rational actor has to make some decision based on rules we can't write up.
Well, I think I can. I'm trying to. Let me ask you this then. Do you think that I can have a series of premises X, Y, and Z, which lead to a conclusion in most circumstances, but then have an exception where in certain circumstances, under certain circumstance, like in certain circumstances, that conclusion may not be reached. Like, is that permissible?
Only if we can define the extent of those exceptions. Only if we can define the range of exceptions we're allowing for. If we have
Yeah,
no idea about the range of exceptions, then no. And to determine the range of exceptions, we kind of need some kind of rule on those exceptions, anyways.
right. But I'm trying to define what the exceptions are, or at least the specific one that I'm trying to appeal to.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And so the specific exceptions I would go to would be to defend either yourself or your property. I think that is a permissible use of a firearm,
Okay.
even if you otherwise um, meet the first three elements that we described, and you otherwise would normally be unpermitted from using a firearm. I think that if you are using a firearm specifically for protection of yourself, your property, or someone else's person or their property, and side note for people who are watching who are much further left leaning, the reason why being that we live in a capitalist society and basically your property is tied intrinsically to your ability to live. I know from personal experience that if you lose your house or your property, you're basically condemned to be homeless or die. So that's the reason I make that argument, if you happen to disagree with me. But
Hmm.
like in that sense, right? If you are using a firearm to protect either yourself or other people, especially if you're using a firearm to protect against other people who are using firearms, I think that is an acceptable exception to the premises and to the rule that we have already established, or the rules we've already established.
Okay. And so now we need to figure out temporally or setting wise, how does that work out? So defending yourself, that's okay. So if your intent, like having the weapon, owning the weapon, whatever with the weapon, was to defend yourself or to defend other people, then that's fine because that's probably what we want those for.
Mhm.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then we need to kind of lock that down time wise. So
Mhm.
in this situation, would you say that he was defending himself with that and that was his intent the entire time?
Um, I would say that, and this is the reason why in the talk with Destiny, I talked about this two different ways. I think that if you divorce this from the circumstances which brought about the events, then yeah, I would say that he was acting in self defense. I think that the fact that he brought himself to there assumed the risk that we had already talked about earlier,
Hmm.
and basically put himself into a situation where he needed to use a gun. I feel like that sort of defeats like the argument that like morally he's justified in using self defense, because it's kind of like, well, he put himself into a situation where he would need to use deadly force, knowing that the situation would arise, right? And I know that you
Yeah.
can get into a sticky situation with like, well, what about the young girl who went to the bar, right? And there, I would draw the distinction between this and there, saying that like, okay, but this is specifically a safety law designed to protect others aside from yourself, not just your own person.
Yeah. And I would have to agree with this, obviously. Like, I would say that, if we had a third video of this dude, like, egging on people, like, go ahead, cross this line, I dare you, stuff
Hmm.
like that. And it's like, okay, your intent was you put yourself in this situation. You clearly wanted to harm other people while you were there. You antagonized other people to engage in, like, some kind of, like, whatever that's going to justify your actions. If that were the case, I would totally agree. I would also agree that we don't have that in this case, so we
Yeah.
kind of begrudgingly have to give that to Kyle.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, like, well, if I was Destiny, he would explore that further. He would take like some crazy analogies to see, like, oh, okay, like how much of a sticky situation can I put myself in before that disappears? Are you comfortable going there, or would you prefer not to?
I mean, like we can, you know. I mean,
Okay.
what time is it? It's 7:48. Yeah, we can talk about that if you want to. I'm not gonna hold you. I don't know, like I don't know, probably for the sake of the audience. I know that a lot of people criticize Destiny for using like a rape analogy. Maybe don't do that. But yeah,
Yeah.
if you want to explore that, we certainly can.
Well, I'm the number one not fan of those. So I don't know how much everybody knows my background, but basically I help like debate people with their rhetoric. So like how they're coming off to people, why arguments aren't like passing with people, like logically maybe are there any problems? And so that's the only reason that I was there with them.
Mhm.
to kind of take this deeper, can you think of a situation that's close to that line for you of where it's like, oh, if they just did this one little thing, then they would cross it. They would not be warranted in self-defense, but the other way it wouldn't? Or is this another like kind of, it's tough to say, it depends on the elements kind of thing?
Well, here, I think that, and I think I said this, right? I think that if he was over the age of 18, that I would have otherwise made it. I think I would have said it would be fine, right? Because from the first thing that kind of sets off this, my logic, my argument is that like the law gives him notice by virtue of the fact that he falls into the category. And so like if the law didn't apply to him, even if we're otherwise accepting the premises that like law that guns are inherently dangerous to have in public, to open carry, and that they that if you do that, it instead of decreasing the risk of death or grievous bodily harm, it increases that risk. I would say that because he didn't have the notice from the law of that possible interpretation of the law, that I would not hold him morally culpable in the same way, right?
Mm.
Like that for me is like that. Like what really does it for me in looking at this circumstance is the fact that he was given notice by the law applying to him, and that by choosing to ignore it or assuming the risk that it didn't apply to him, that he ended up I would describe him moral culpability. But if it didn't apply to him, I don't think I would come to that same conclusion.
Okay. And that's probably a good segue because I actually don't want to explore this any further. That's fair enough for me.
Okay.
And like Chad is mentioning, both during our conversation and in your Discord after, like I rail pretty hard against the rape stuff. So I completely disagree with its use. I don't do that.
Okay.
Anywho, with this 18 notice of the law kind of thing, so and correct me if I have this wrong. The idea is that the spirit of the law should be obvious if you read the law, and that Kyle, in his position, with his training, with his background, whatever, probably read the law, and therefore, should have gleaned the information about why the law was passed, and then should have applied that to his own decisions. And if he didn't, then that means that he like willfully ignored the purpose of the law, and that kind of like adds some extra culpability to him.
It's close. I think I would specify that it's more that even if he read the law and ended up interpreting it to talk more about like the issue of being underage or like issues relating to being underage, and he interpreted it to mean that and thought he could mitigate the factors, I think that making that interpretation, whereas like it very, very likely, again, to me, like I am assuming that based on his training, based on I guess I'm basing off of like what I interpret to be like a reasonable interpretation of the law, right? That it had to
Mhm.
occur to him at least once that the law was trying to prevent people in his position for some reason from causing harm to other people, right? And that by choosing to ignore the law when it applied to him for whatever reason, that he assumed the risk of choosing to ignore it, right? And therefore,
Sure.
since he assumed the risk of choosing to ignore it, that he assumed the risk that the law was trying to prevent from being brought about,
Okay.
specifically causing death or grievous bodily harm. Yeah. So if he
So,
caused, yeah. Sorry.
oh, I have a fun one. Let's
Okay.
do a crazy analogy.
All right. Let's do it.
So, so basically, and to kind of put this one more time, so Kyle is morally culpable because the notice that was given to him, and
Mhm.
whether or not he understood the reasoning behind that notice, he could at least understand that this is to mitigate risk of some kind of sort. And because he engaged in that activity and he harmed people, he should be held pretty culpable for that harm that he caused to other people, right?
I would say so. Yeah.
Awesome. So I'll start with an easier version. So let's say somebody walks into like a public swimming pool, nobody's there. They see a sign that says, wait 10 minutes. It doesn't really say when that 10 minutes was. They
Mhm.
jump into the pool, and it turns out that it was highly acidic and it eats them away and they die. Are they culpable for that death because they saw the sign that gave them that posted notice of warning against harm and then they jumped in? Is that kind of on them?
No, going back to the distinction I drew earlier between this and like the rape girl analogy, I think that this
Hmm.
law is different for consideration because it is trying to mitigate a risk that you, being the person who's following the law, cause some kind of harm to others. Whereas that
Hmm.
law would be similar to like the rape girl analogy, where like the law is trying to mitigate harm being prevented to you. If you want to assume a risk that harm would come to you or be caused to you, I don't think that's necessarily morally culpable in the same way of you assuming a risk of causing harm to others.
Ah, okay. So because you assume that that risk would only apply to you kind of deal, or?
Essentially, it's like assuming that a risk would be caused to others. Because again, like I don't want to
Mm.
mitigate. Like I don't think that there's the same moral culpability for example, like a 17-year-old choosing to disregard a smoking law. And smoking a cigarette at the age of 17, even though I think don't you have to wait till you're 18? I can't remember. I never smoked. But like I wouldn't hold them to be morally culpable in the way that I would say that Kyle is in this circumstance, because it's not like they're causing, it's not like Kyle like shot himself in the foot, right? Um I guess that I'm also having like an underlying assumption that I don't know, maybe there's an underlying assumption that I don't think that there's moral culpability for causing harm to yourself.
Okay.
Um there's
Yeah,
probably like I think that there's a basic like underlying assumption there that could be extended here.
that's totally fair. And I thought about like including other people and harming them in the analogy, but I wanted to keep it here and see if that was like part of it. So I would
Okay.
definitely agree that we probably want to focus on the harm it caused to other people.
Mhm.
So if I could kind of edit what the idea is so far. So Kyle, looking at that law, should have been able to assume that there was harm that could have been caused to other people as a result of not following that law. And whether or not he thought that law would apply to him or that harm would apply to him and these other people or not, it was clear that this law was aimed at preventing harm to other people. And because it was aimed at preventing harm to other people and he ignored it, he should assume the risk.
I would say that's fair.
Okay. Okay. Um, so to change this analogy a bit, but maybe keep a pool in it,
Mhm.
if there was a sign that said, don't bring pool water outside of the pool, and somebody were to, before going into a sauna, take up a big ladle of that pool water and bring it with them into the sauna, throw it on the rocks, and then they kill everybody in the room because the chlorine gas just gets to everybody. Are they morally culpable for the people that they killed in there?
I'm sorry. Wait, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, of course.
Mhm.
So oftentimes, if there's like a pool and a sauna in the same place, there will be something about taking the water out or not using it or something along those lines.
Mhm.
But it's not always clear on what the consequences of that thing are, though there may be a rule against it. So
Mhm.
if somebody were to take pool water out of the pool, bring it
Mhm.
with them into the sauna, throw it on the rocks, and they kill everybody in that sauna room with the gas, are they held morally culpable for those deaths?
Is there a rule that says that people should not bring pool water into the sauna?
Yes.
Where is that visible, or where is that posted? Where is it?
Right next to the sauna.
Okay, then yeah, I would probably hold that person to be morally culpable.
Okay. And they're not morally culpable then in this case because they assumed risk to other people though, right?
Wait, they're not
Because
morally
they
culpable? I'm sorry, what?
oh, you're so I'm not going to make too many claims. I'm just going to like ask questions and
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
explore your ideas.
Right.
So what I'm saying is it seems like in this scenario, they didn't
Mhm.
assume a risk to other people when they did that. I don't even think they really understood the risk fully, but they engaged in an activity that was disallowed, whether they understood why or not. And in the process, they hurt other people. And you're saying that this person shouldn't be culpable, though the rule does seem to be aimed at
Wait, I thought
preventing
I
harm to yourself and others.
wait, I thought I said that they would be.
He is culpable?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So he's culpable, but he didn't know the purpose of that rule either, right?
I mean, I think that it should be. Hmm.
Because if he knew the purpose, assumably, and this is why I tried to prep
Hmm.
like a really good
Okay. Yeah,
analogy.
yeah, yeah. No, that's absolutely fair. Okay, like I think that's so we're focusing on whether the law's purpose would be readily apparent to someone um who violates
Yeah,
it. Okay,
like
okay.
if I give my personal perspective in here, if I can just jump in and be
Yeah, go
Noah for
for it.
like 2 seconds,
Mhm.
I personally I just don't think we should tie the moral culpability to whether or not somebody like should have reasonably understood the law because just people are dumb and they think what they think of it. I think like we could just focus in that case then just on the law itself because ultimately where your argument breaks down, which is that like oh, if it was like literally like one day off of being 18, you would still hold this argument, and you were like, yeah, like
Mhm.
that's his own little victory that he likes, whatever. It's not like personally satisfying for me, but I think that it does demonstrate that maybe we need different rules here, or to like broaden it in a way that we really wouldn't want to, like just pinning it to the law, since the law is so like interwoven with your morality stuff here. It
Mhm.
might be helpful to just like talk about it in terms of the law
Well, I
but
don't know about
it's such
that.
a tough, tricky little argument.
It is like a tough, tricky little argument. I think that like no, I think I see like the argument that like it wouldn't apply here in that case, because like here, I don't think that I would, like, if I'm putting myself in the guy's position, right? I don't think that I would have reasonably understood why the law was promulgated. Like that's kind of like one of those laws where it's like, why does this exist? I don't think that anyone looking at that law would have necessarily understood or at least interpreted it to have meant that it could cause death or grievous bodily harm to someone. I think that's very different from like an open carry law, right? Which is specifically going towards like preventing someone from
You're
being
making a big assumption about people that normally use guns and stuff like that, which is like a big part of why I'm talking to people about this, to try to pull them away from that, because there's a lot of people for whom the common sense is the exact opposite, for whom they deal like you said, like you have personal experience with guns. I don't think some people take the extra step and they get upset when you say things like about what guns are exactly for or what guns exactly always do, when a lot of the time from their perspective they're using something as like a show of force or something that's supposed to like scare people off. And if they're engaging in that kind of behavior, they'll get really upset at the idea that you're saying they're there to kill people or something like that, because when they threw that rifle with them and took it wherever, I'm sure that on the forefront of their mind was not killing somebody. It was probably keeping themselves safe or something like that.
Yeah, but it's very hard for me to imagine a world where someone could look at a gun or at a law that's preventing someone for whatever reason from being able to use a gun in public and not understand that law to be trying to mitigate some kind of harm. Like that's incredibly hard for me to be able to see someone to be able to logically, like, even if you have someone who like has gone their entire life handling a gun and has like and comes from a very pro-gun family and culture, it's incredibly hard for me to someone who can look at that law square in the face and not think that it's trying to mitigate harm, you know?
And I 100% agree. I just think that like they may think they're above it. And the moment they think they're above it, there's not enough like nuance in the argument to catch that bit of it. Like, oh, okay, well, I guess they're just dumb because they didn't see that what's so obvious to us, that like obviously a gun safety law.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, we're also assuming Kyle to be a reasonable person. Like, yeah, I guess that like we're assuming him to be a reasonable person. Like if he's an unreasonable person, then yeah, he might otherwise be not morally culpable, right? If he's just like dumb as a sack of bricks or whatever. But my argument is that like any reasonable person would at least occur to them at some point that Kyle, being a reasonable person, it would have occurred to him that this law is trying to mitigate harm.
Yeah. And an uncomfortable branch of this that I don't think ever gets brought up because I think it's uncomfortable, is that I think the harm that the law was meant to stop probably has a lot to do with accidental usage or inappropriate usage or improper usage. And I don't think, because like we said before, we can kind of justify outside context aside, that Kyle was justified in self-defense here. So I actually think he used that rifle really appropriately, and he demonstrated control and experience in his use of that rifle, though unfortunate the circumstances behind that are. And so I almost feel like what's not discussed is that this is not the kind of harm that was probably meant to be stopped by that law.
Well, yeah, and I think that like there probably is like a reasonable interpretation of the law that is what it's going towards. Again, I'm not saying that Kyle couldn't have interpreted the law to mean something aside from, oh, well, there's, that the law is trying to prevent at least some people from causing harm to others. I guess in this case, intentionally using it. But I think that for me, the thing, and again, like the thing that ultimately gives me belief that he's morally culpable is the fact that he consciously made the choice to interpret it the way that he did and disregarded the interpretation which carried the much more significant threat of its consequence, and therefore assumed the risk that choosing to ignore it would bring about, right? Like ignoring an interpretation of that law which carried a risk of causing death or severe bodily harm to someone else, I think is, for me, what gives him moral culpability, since he basically just, like if we're looking at a Kyle Rittenhouse sitting in his house looking at the law for the first time, if there's like one of two or three different interpretations he could come to, I would say that like I would say that if there is an interpretation of the law which would lead to a much greater harm if violated, or a much greater risk of harm, then that's the one that he should ultimately follow, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I see the chat. I wish I could reply to all of you guys with these individual points, but I can't.
Yeah, hey chat, don't do like we're I don't know, I'm having a very good conversation. I feel like this is good faith. I'm listen, like my chat, like I'm telling my chat right now, treat him with the utmost courtesy. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of as far as I wanted to go with that. I almost feel like this is a development in the way that I understand you viewing this. So it was the it was the fact that he chose to interpret it the way he chose to, that seems to kind of be closer to what the problem would be, right? That,
I
like,
think
you
so.
read that safety law, and the fact that you made that choice to interpret it that way, that you just, like, hand wave all of the possible harm it could cause other people, that's kind of part of the problem?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So then going back to the pool example, couldn't we use that as a rule and say that, like, open disregard or fragrant whatever disregard of, like, safety laws is kind of like a worthy checkbox to have?
Well, it depends on whether or not it's a reasonable interpretation for someone to make, I would say. Um,
Oh,
because I mean, like, I think it's a more reasonable interpretation in this scenario for someone to say that the law is trying to prevent a misuse of a gun in public, and an intentional misuse of a gun in public to cause death or grievous bodily harm for someone. I'm not sure if it's a reasonable interpretation for the person in the pool sauna analogy to interpret the rule saying, don't throw pool water in the sauna because it might cause people to die, right? Like one
yeah.
seems pretty intuitive, the other is just like a wildly out there kind of interpretation. It probably
Yes.
would require like a pretty specific disclaimer on like the rule, like, hey, do not do this because it can cause people to fucking die.
Yeah. Which is why, like, I racked my brain for one where the rule can somehow not clearly give us what the consequence could be.
Yeah. No, I would say that if you had like a rule that wasn't intuitive enough to people for them to be able to understand that like violating it could cause such a serious harm to other people, then it should come with like a basis for why, right? Like don't violate this law because like it can possibly fucking kill people, you know? I think
Yeah.
that for some laws it's pretty intuitive, but for some like that, like what you described, it probably requires like a pretty explicit disclaimer.
So given that, would you personally think then that when Kyle looked at the law, he thought a, like, for thee, not for me sort of like mentality to it? Like he understood that it's probably meant to stop people like him, but for some reason or another, he's not included in that group?
I think that's a way to interpret it. It's either that he didn't read it and I would say that if he didn't read it, then he acted negligently because I would say that any person acting reasonably should have checked the law. But then if he did read it and he assumed himself out of the category, that would itself rest on the assumption that it was based on the idea that that the law was trying to mitigate a harm caused by certain factors rather than just an inherent danger of using a firearm, right?
Hmm.
And so like there would still be like the baked in assumption or choice that like, oh, the law is telling me that this would be dangerous because of reasons X, Y, and Z about young people, as opposed to something inherently dangerous about me for whatever reason using a gun, right?
Okay. And just to be clear, you personally don't think then that he read that law at all?
I don't know whether he did. It's either he did and he made that choice, or he didn't, and I would say he acted negligently.
Hmm. Okay. Do you personally feel like morally unsatisfied with the way the last conversation panned out, where we kind of ended on this note of like, you know, so it's only like a few days technically, like this is an age argument. You're like, well, yeah, kind of, because like with the principles I have, I'm limited by like the practical application of law, and just like given practically what we have in that one state, this is like
Mhm.
how I can view it. But if it were different places, unfortunately, I would have to have like different takes on it. Is that like frustrating at all or not?
I mean, a little bit. This is again, it goes back to like my criticism of the law, right? Like, I want a law which gives everyone notice that we shouldn't have open carrying at all because it's been shown to demonstrably increase risk as opposed to decrease risk, right? So I am a little
Hmm.
frustrated that like that isn't the law in Wisconsin and in a lot of states, right? And yeah, I would have to basically morally concede that in other states where you had a different circumstance, either no law or someone who the law didn't apply to, I couldn't apply the same framework. doesn't mean I can't apply other frameworks, but I wouldn't be able to apply this one in the same way I am here. And yeah, that's a little frustrating, but like I do want to counterbalance like my own interest in trying to mitigate harm with the fact that a lot of people, like I am trying to be like I know that Destiny brought this up in our conversation, right? Like I don't want to try and like make everyone like I don't want to try and make it so that like every person has to constantly think about like their you know, the morality of every single thing that they do down to like an atomistic level, right? Like I don't think that's reasonable to expect of people. So I am trying to like balance that interest against, you know, like these kind of moral considerations. Like I am trying to be fair in it, you know.
Yeah, and just to like be completely honest, like I, you know, I think you're more fair than most people. So I try to sing your praises when I hear of you, even if it's like, you know, dum-dums in the comment section saying something silly about like one way or the other about your arguments. It's like, yeah, well, you know, there's just going to be all these people that just get upset, especially if a conversation doesn't go out the way he wants. You know, there's going to be some small segment that goes after you and is upset about it. So I would like you know, I've been there, I get it. I would try to like, you know, I get the position. It sucks, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm like rambling.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Let's see. All right, so I think that's everything as far as the last Destiny talk. Did you want to get into the Zan debate thing or the third point?
I mean, we can talk about it a little bit. I don't want to like the one problem with the Zan debate and that he acknowledged when he was talking to Destiny like part of the way through is that he was like falsely representing a lot of like other people's positions. I assume that this would include like Vosh and Vermin and Conyer, right? So I don't want to go to like those kind of arguments because I can't say like I haven't talked to them much of it all about this beyond like I think I messaged Voss like, hey, fucking I'm sorry that this happened, right? And that was basically it. So I don't want to talk too much out like from where I can't, but you know, to the extent that I'm able, we can talk about it.
Yeah. I guess then to like broaden it a bit, I like where you say like I'm kind of just I'm agreeing with Destiny on these points about like quickly judging and attacking people online without full context. And I think that that's like a big like theme to like all the issues that we're having in this Xander debate, right? Like it's a lot of like, oh, like what can we say of the intentions of people that like post a clip or like like what do they put the title as, how many people pick it up, like what expectations do we have of our communities and how they're going to respond to that content if we put it out there like that. And it was interesting to see that explored, though unfortunately I don't think Zan was the best person to have that conversation with Destiny. I do think it was like neat to see some of the arguments play out for sure.
Yeah. I mean, like, it sucked because a lot of the conversation, I mean, like, the posturing was, and I sympathize with Zan, right? Because it sounds like he, and like Vosh too, right? Are long-standing, like, fans, friends, whatever you want to call it, of Destiny. It sucks seeing it, right? Like, it just, like, regardless of the merits of the arguments, it's sad to see. I suppose that, like, for me, as far as, like, the merits of it, I do have to, like, I don't know, because, like, I know people in my life, without getting too much into the weeds about it, like I do, like I've seen similar things play out in my life where you have people who, regardless of whether or not you agree with their positions or their arguments, are probably based on the totality of the evidence, like all around decent people, right? And who are pretty regularly, at least in their perspective, mistreated by the people who they would hold out to be their friends, or people who otherwise, on one hand, say that they just want an amicable conversation, and then on the other hand, say that you know, and then like shit on him, like I think in his words, like 10 minutes or a day or whatever after the conversation ends. I felt terrible because like I don't like, you know, I probably fell into this category a little bit, right? Like I wanted to have a really good conversation with him, and then after the conversation ended, now mind you, this was on, I mean, like it was on a stream that's unlisted now, but I mean, it happened all the same. Someone asked me, well, hey, is Destiny using responsible rhetoric? And I would say no. And then I like made a comment about like, well, I mean, like, didn't someone, and this is hearsay, right? I think I said it at the time, but I said, well, doesn't he have like sociopathy, right? And I shouldn't have said it. like that was a shitty comment for me to make. I shouldn't speculate about people's mental health. I feel terrible about doing it because I think if he, like, the minute that he brought that up in the Zan debate, I was like, fuck, I'm guilty of this as well. And I feel awful about it. And this is me trying to, I suppose, do a little penance for that.
You know, like, this is actually, funnily enough, something that, like, I'm torn on because
Mm,
I think it almost gives him a free pass for criticism that he probably really, really needs,
mm-hmm,
right? Like, if there was something that was really, really bad there, like, for instance, in the Zan conversation, the thing that Zan pointed out was what seems like a very facetious lie. I can't say whether or not it was or wasn't, but it seemed very clear to the audience at the time that it was a bit of a ruse and to people that
mm-hmm.
viewed after. So I
Yeah.
think pointing out like a blatant thing like that is fine. I think the problem is when that person, every time they're asked about the argument, goes, "Oh yeah, he's a liar and he lied to me and like you should see the clip about it." Like that's when I have a problem. But if you want
Yeah.
to have like an honest complaint and balance it with like some positive thing like you do, or like
Mm-hmm,
I would like to think that I try to do a lot of the time,
mm-hmm.
I think that that's way more acceptable. And I think that somebody like Destiny, who often has these like big blunders that he doesn't see because he ignores optics and he focuses at this logical level that, like we kind of saw, over the last hour, is kind of hard to like walk people through and it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's where I struggle with it, is it feels like it gives them a free card from criticism. Like if somebody sees something after the debate, they're going to feel afraid to point it out because they feel like they're contributing to that culture.
Yeah. I suppose that my comment on this is like, well, part of me in responding to this is like, I am steel manning a little bit, right? Like I am kind of like taking, like I am assuming, in like sort of like adopting, like apologizing and also adopting this policy for myself and my community going forward. I am steel manning the idea that like for most of, if not all of the times that he has been in this way, sort of like criticized or like backtalked or whatever after a debate, that it's been unwarranted, right? I do think that like, I suppose that what I want to make sure is that like, I don't want to discourage people from being able to call out something after a debate if like someone says something blatantly wrong during the course of a debate or discussion or whatever, and it turns out they're like lying or acting in super bad faith after the fact based on new evidence, right? Like I don't want to discourage that, but I also want to counterbalance that against like just taking I want to make sure that I'm phrasing this. I want to make sure that people are actually doing that and like genuinely calling out like what they perceive to be a lie or a misconception or like something that was said in bad faith at the time, and not just like shitting on someone because they didn't like how how it went over for their end after the fact. Like I think that there
Mhm.
are a difference between those two things. One of them is in, I guess this might be what he calls the Destiny support group, right? I've only heard him describe it, I haven't seen it myself. And the other might be, if you agree with Zan, something like what Zan was doing, where it's not so much he's complaining after the fact, but more that he is trying to call out something that he perceives to be a genuine misrepresentation from the discussion, right? I think those
Yeah.
are two different things.
I like the way that I picture it, because I've been trying to think on like what this is and how to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
The way that I think about it is like instances of criticism we're okay with. The problem is that like the more and more you hit that button, the more and more you send out those instances of criticism, the more likely it is that they'll catch on enough to be the broader characterization of the
Yeah.
debate. And what we're really worried about is when the characterization is negative. So like having a single complaint is fine if like you balance it out with like 80% talking like more broadly about what happened and it seems like you're being more fair. But if 80% of what you're talking about is this one instance that was bad, then it's like, well, that's now you're more broadly characterizing the debate as this one instance. And that's when it becomes a problem. But it's like, how do we balance that? Because from our perspective, all we can do are mention instances. And it's almost like characterization is kind of out of our control in the minds of the audience. But at the same time, you put enough instances out there and people are going to reliably characterize the debate one way or the other. So you can't say that either. So you're
Yeah.
in a tough spot.
Yeah, I don't have a necessarily great answer. I mean, this is something I'm thinking about, right? I think that there could probably be something that the influencer, the creator, whatever you want to call them, the person with the channel is doing, and there's like a responsibility to them and also a responsibility to the audience, right? I think that there is a greater onus that should be put on audience members. I mean, to the extent that's possible, right? Again, we can't control people, but to the
Right.
extent that we are able to cultivate that sort of mentality, right, to make sure that people do not take clips out of context and actually go back and be like, and do some due diligence to the extent that they're able, right? Sometimes people just don't have the time to be able to, but to the extent that people are able to investigate the full context, and to the extent that they're not able to suspend full judgment until they know more, right? And I think that ideally should be coupled with an expectation on creators to, levy criticism fairly, but also make sure that, like, I don't know, like, it can sometimes be as simple as like, hey, if you want the full context, here's a link to the video, go watch it, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it can be something as simple as that,
And I think a huge part of it, and part of like, to be more specific about the Zan conversation, part of like what is criticism for Vosh is that like there are measures that you could take where you're saying things in your own community or managing the characterization they have of talks. And I think his criticism was that Vosh didn't go far enough, per his idea of friendship,
Mm-hmm.
to warrant staying friends. And I think like for like a better example of doing this properly, I would say that like you and your community, every time that I've chimed in or like stopped by the stream, every time you talk about that debate, you're fair about it. You give like, I still disagree with him on this. I think he's reasonable on this. I think you guys in particular are kind of hard on him about this. And so I think you should maybe consider the opposite. But I think giving that caveat all the time and managing the characterization that your audience has of things, is what he's looking for out of Vosh or out of creators, probably in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, like, and I don't know, this is one place where Destiny and I might disagree, as like a fundamental premise, right?
Hmm.
Because I know that he maintains the premise that like, and I have to figure out how I'm going to manage my own community, right? This is something I'm always thinking about. But I know that he, when he was debating Zan, said in some form or another, and you can correct me if I misrepresent it, that if you have an association with someone who does something like what he characterized Vermin and Conyer did to Destiny, right? If Vosh had an association with those people and did that to, and did like, and misrepresented in Destiny's view what Destiny did, or like caused harm to him, that he would say that would put a culpability on Vosh to abandon that relationship with those people. I
Yeah.
would, that's one place where fundamentally I would disagree with him, and that like most of my, like a lot of my worldview generally tends to originate from the basic premise of I want to do absolutely everything in my power to make sure that I don't abandon my relationships with people, because I believe that by virtue of having a relationship with people, that I can, even if they have done things which are morally wrong, improve them as people, right? That is one place where fundamentally Destiny and I probably disagree. If I was in Vosh's position, I probably wouldn't abandon my relationship with them, in the same way that I have known a lot of people in my life who have been morally wrong, even to me, right? I grew up in a family of people who are very conservative, and a lot of them, I mean, like, fortunately, the vast majority of them have been kind to me. Actually, a great example is when I came out as trans, I came out to the person who was the love of my life, and she was a Southern Baptist girl, and her politics matched the way that she responded to the situation. And it did not end great between us. I ended up with a ring back in my hand after everything was said and done. I would still maintain that she is one of the best people I've ever known, because even divorced from that situation, I did everything that I could to try and maintain a relationship with her, even after, and we don't have to get into the specifics, she had treated me in a way that a lot of people would probably consider to be morally wrong. I wanted to do everything that I could to help her, because I fundamentally believe that she was a morally good person. Even if people might otherwise disagree with me. Again, this is like a perspective that I have, which is probably more radical than I can expect of a lot of people. And I'm not expecting other people to adopt this position, but it is mine. And I think it's a reason that a lot of people who I know in my life who have been more conservative or more transphobic or whatever you want to, insert negative quality, I would maintain that's a reason that a lot of them have improved for the better in the course of them knowing me, and me not choosing to just abandon my relationship with them.
Mm. And like your chat is saying, and kind of like how I would respond to this, it's
Hmm.
tough to speak on anybody's, lines that
Yeah.
they draw for friends or relationships or any of that stuff. So like Xander coming on and debating somebody on like, their qualifications for friendship was never going to work out well. Probably not the conversation you want to have with somebody, especially if you don't know them personally. If you haven't like already made the list of friend, that's probably like not a conversation that you could necessarily have. Um, and I would say though that like in much the same way through that brief explanation you've given me of like how you are viewing things and the little nod to like where that's going and forgiving people and things like that. I think like for Destiny's situation, it makes sense that he has these rules. Like if you
Hmm.
think being like a big streamer for as long as he's been a big streamer, these are people with such like really great fake personalities that are so persistent that you almost kind of have to go off of like action and inaction because if
Yeah.
you just look at their words they'll be perfect.
Hmm.
And so I feel like that he does have to have some kind of like hard fast metric. And there's also this weird relationship where like he works with these people too, like he has to
Hmm.
maintain some kind of professional relationship, and moving forward he may even have to continue talking with Vosh. So
Hmm.
it's like, do you need that friendship dimension if you already have the professional one? And in this unique situation, do you really want to keep trying to be friends with somebody who when they had the opportunity didn't act in a way you personally feel is right? Like no, you should probably, stick to your gut and whatever, and if that doesn't work out then you can improve that process, but to each their own kind of deal.
Yeah, I guess I'll say this right now, in that like I'm not trying to persuade, like I'm not trying to present that basic policy premise, whatever you want to call it, as like a, like I'm not trying to persuade people to adopt it, right? I think that like I agree with you, and I think that Destiny's perspective is a reasonable one based on what he has experienced. I think that a lot of people probably end up like identifying with a position that's close to Destiny's, even if they don't necessarily want to say it, right? Like I
Hmm.
think that a reasonable person very well could, like, let's say that you just have any friend whose girlfriend or significant other, roommate or whatever, like goes on to just social media and just starts shit talking you until you lose your job, right? I think like I wouldn't hold it against anyone for distancing yourself or saying that your friendship is over with the initial person, right? Like I think that that's an entirely reasonable perspective to take, right? And mind you, I'm not I'm not trying to say this like necessarily to believe me either. Like I understand that,
Hmm.
I take a rather altruistic look at that, or not altruistic. I take a different look, and anyone could look at me and just be like, oh well, she's just full of shit lying, right? Um, like I totally get that, and I think that it's fair to say that someone should evaluate other people based on their actions. In a lot of ways, I do, right? Um, like for example, like early in transition, there are a lot of people who I knew, who I was very close to, who were in my family and my friends, who misgendered me a good amount because it was a new thing. They had known me for a long time as one thing, and this was something very different. And they would tell me time and time again, oh, I'm like, they would misgender me, and then they'd be like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. And then they would do it again in like a week, right? Now I've gotten to the point where most, like, just about all these people have figured it out. It's been a couple of years at this point.
Yeah.
But similarly, I would often tell people by the end of it, I really don't care about what you say, just don't fucking do it, right? And I got really annoyed, right? And there are a lot of times where I was very tempted to just like abandon my relationship with these people altogether. And I think that it's reasonable for anyone to abandon those relationships if they want to. I just made the policy decision that I want to try and make a difference in these people's lives. And in order to do that, I think I have to maintain a relationship with them, you know? And it was because of that that I didn't. And only because of that that I didn't, I cared about them. But I don't think that like anyone has to do it. And I think that the way that Destiny looks at the world and how he interacts with other people is entirely reasonable based on his perception, at least, of how everything has transpired.
Yeah, and then to take that to, like, a more bad faith place, like, I think at a
Hmm.
more broad level, he said that his logical consequences or his logical thinking on things, so if
Hmm.
you guys, agree with him here, but you're like, "But that Kyle Rittenhouse take was still just too hot, I don't care what she says about that," like, Also keep in mind that this also applies to a lot of his logical takes. He says that like because he looks at all these things as premise, whatever, and he had to start with some really uncomfortable questions at like base morality and work his way up from there. The conclusions he reaches are going to be really confusing to you, but if you explore it with him, he'll walk you all the way down to like what is the meaning of life or whatever, you know? So arguing with him is going to be a difficult thing. Convincing him of something is going to be difficult without understanding him. And so
Mhm.
if you ever see arguments between him and other people, just realize that that rigid system that he's trying to adhere to is like a religion of sorts for him. And even when it produces results that you personally wouldn't agree with or you wouldn't like, you know, follow, he's been following that for so long that I think there's a lot of like staying power to that as well. And until he faces something that's reasonably convincing, which he's set at like a very high threshold, he's probably not going to move off of it.
Yeah, and that seems to be my impression of him. I don't know. Again, like I expect this video to go up and I'll take some flack for it, but that's fine. I'd rather take some flack for something that I feel pretty confident in than to say something that I don't believe in, and get views for it. I do have a decent amount of respect for him, and I'm sorry that this happened. I don't want to. Now, I'm not saying this like I don't know. I'm not trying to like kiss up or whatever. Again, this isn't
Sure.
like a video that I'm necessarily like. I mean, it's targeted at Destiny, but at the same time, it's more just me trying to signal to my audience, since everyone is talking about this, my sort of position on it and how I want to take this and move forward, right? Regardless of whether or not we ever interact, I think that like the problems that arose here can easily arise in other situations, and I just want to be prepared for them.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about this point three, because right now would probably be a good transition into it, where
Mm.
like your opinions on this, like at a logical level or whatever.
Um, so point three that goes to like the rhetoric.
Yeah, like a natural consequence of constantly interacting with people who, on one hand, say they're your friend, but then this happens on Twitter. Like that's what I was trying to say in my first point. I didn't even realize that you
Oh,
worded it that way, but
oh,
sounds almost
I'm sorry. I'm
identical.
sorry. I mean, we can talk about that. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I thought we already touched on it a little bit, but yeah, if you want to talk
We
about it
did.
more, then we certainly can.
That's all I'm saying is I just realized that like, oh, I opened up with that. Never mind. I was
Yeah, yeah,
gonna
yeah.
say there's a good transition into your opinion there, but we're like the same on that, so I don't think we'll argue on anything.
Okay. Is there anything else that we want to talk about?
Nope, that's good for me unless you had any other questions.
No, I think I'm good. And also, what time is it? We've been talking on this for like an hour and a half, so that's probably a good place to drop it. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. This has been this has been a good chat.
Yeah, not a problem. I'm BookSmarts on Twitch. If anybody ever wants more calm approaches to this sort of stuff or wants to understand why some of these like heated debate bro people are arguing over the minutia of something that seems like it doesn't matter. If you're curious, you know, stop by or check out the YouTube and I try to condense all that into something that's understandable to people.
Hey, mods, can we put Booksmarks like links into the description while we can? That would be really. And also, like, if you want to like message your links to one of my admins or mods, then I'll have them drop it in there if someone doesn't already.
Yeah, if they want to DM me, I'll reply with whatever
Oh,
whatever they
there's
want.
YouTube. Um, all right, yeah, all right, but yeah, if you want to DM them, then yeah, we can drop that in there. And of course, like Booksmarts is in my Discord. They're listed as one of the content creators. So yeah, please go check them out.
Awesome. Have a good rest of your stream.
Thanks, appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.